Right, good morning everybody and welcome to the SMI weekly seminar. I acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the land on which we meet today. On behalf of the Sustainable Minerals Institute, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. This morning we have Sarah Mackenzie, and her talk will be on the participatory processes, mine closure and social transitions. Sarah will be presenting the results from the participatory process, mine closure and social transitions research project carried out under the social aspects of mine closure research consortium at UQ. The objective of the study was to understand the potential participatory mechanisms to achieve a socially just transition and a positive social legacy as integral to any concept of sustainability of mining. As normal, there is the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you can give that a push and paste your questions in there during the talk. When we come to the end, I will then pose your questions to Sarah, as well as a panel of the research team that has been part of this. So once again, in terms of the seminars, we're going to try something a little bit different this morning in terms of the Q&A session. So please put your questions in, and then at the end of the presentation, we will endeavour to answer them. So Sarah, over to you, and look forward to the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neville, and good morning, everybody. It's always daunting to present in front of people. It's somewhat more daunting to present in front of a blank screen, but I hope you can hear me okay, and Nathan, just step in if there's any technical hitches. So thank you, Neville, and as Neville mentioned, I'll be presenting the results of a project conducted with my colleagues Joanne Everingham and Camilla Svobodova at the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, and Kathy Witt of the UQ Centre for Natural Gas under the Social Aspects of Mine Closure Research Consortium here at UQ. And as Neville said, we're trying something slightly different. So Joanne and Camilla are here as well, and I will present our work, but we can all answer any questions you may have at the end. Just a brief word on the Social Aspects of Mine Closure Research Consortium. It's a multi-party industry university research collaboration that was established in 2019. Through the consortium funded research, we aim to better understand the social dimensions of mine closure, identify strategies for improving post-mining features for the communities, and drive the integration of social dimensions into mine life cycle transformation in the transition towards closure and beyond. Our consortium partners are Anglo American, BHP, MMG, Newcrest, Newmont, Oceana Gold, and Rio Tinto. The research projects conducted during 2019 are listed here, ours being participatory processes, mine closure and social transitions.
Share screen, Sarah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't. There we go. There's a technical glitch for you. Now, let me see. Can you all see that?
Yes, Sarah, that's fine. We're all online.
Okay. So thank you. And as I said, this is the so you haven't seen any of this. So this is our research consortium projects from 2019, and ours is the one in bold, participatory processes and mine closure and social transitions. The content of our presentation today will draw out some of the highlights from our work on the topic, and the full report of our study and the other research conducted in 2019 is available on our website, mineclosure.net. So I wanted to start with a bit of context. before launching into the work on our study. The terms public participation, stakeholder engagement, they're more than familiar to exploration and mining companies as they prospect for resources and build and operate mines. Public participation in the decisions around how a company can fit into the community helps to build mutual understanding, respect, and good relations. And the focus is on how the company can operate peacefully and harmoniously as long as it's in the neighborhood, so to speak. But what about when it leaves? And so why is participation for closure important? And what exactly are people participating in? Just to remind us a bit of the amplitude of the question, here in Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales alone, there are an estimated 155 mines projected to close by 2030. And a recent paper published by CSRM into regulating the social aspects of mine closure in these 3 Australian states highlighted that most jurisdictions require an environmental impact and social impact assessment and a mine closure plan to be prepared for projects that anticipate significant environmental and social impacts as part of the approvals process. Regulators require that these studies and plans do consider the impacts during mining, closure, and post-closure phases. And in addition, most jurisdictions require the engagement of affected communities in the planning and approvals process and throughout the mine life cycle. It's during the approvals phase that project proponents first negotiate mine closure and social impact conditions with government and other authorities, such as traditional owners. So as such, once a project is approved, these conditions actually become enforceable. And so what do we mean by the social aspects of mine closure? There are many, of course, but here are a few points, and you will see that for all of them, if you imagine being in the company's shoes or even the government's shoes, it's hard to imagine addressing these points without involving the people concerned, without enabling them to participate in the process of thinking through the issues and deciding what to do. So with point 1, workforce and employment transitions, this is a really significant area with many different aspects. It includes workforce planning first and foremost, and the approach for holding talent in place for closure processes while letting other staff go. Bearing in mind that many of those staff will come from the local community. It can include retraining, identifying transferable skills, liaising with other industries to understand redeployment possibilities. In some places, this will include liaising with other mines in the area or other sites in the same company but outside the area. It's important, of course, to match retraining to the transition strategy. It's no good training people in areas that will not be useful for future employment. And the approach will also depend on whether the mine is a FIFO or a residential operation and the local context. On the second point, this is about towns run by the mine and the process of transitioning those towns to a local government authority that takes responsibility for infrastructure, services, and other matters. The trajectory will have a lot to do with the town's dependency on the mine. There's a lot to think about in a normalization process. So if the mine has run the water or power infrastructure, a town would have to think about the viability of infrastructure maintenance and the extent to which things will run at a profit or at least be cost neutral after mine closure. Another aspect relates to population. If people move out of the area, this can impact thresholds for state-run services such as health and education. If schools drop below certain numbers, then they may lose teachers. A normalizing town will have to consider these kinds of matters. Land use obviously relates to what the land is actually used for, but it also relates to zoning, leases, and legal status of the land. In many jurisdictions, it's not easy to transition a mining lease to a pastoral lease or a lease for another purpose, such as tourism. Some jurisdictions have very tight, some would say outdated, regulations around the transfer of industrial use land to other appropriate economic purposes. And the voice of the local community will be essential in identifying what those other appropriate purposes may be. Housing and accommodation is often a contentious topic. A local housing market is usually most affected during construction and during mine closure, i.e. demand during construction and a slump at closure. Cheap accommodation after closure can see a different socio-demographic mix emerge, perhaps a lower socioeconomic profile, and with that can come a need for different kinds of services. understanding the future demographic mix of a post-mining population is an important aspect of mine closure. Difficult to predict, but possible to preempt to some extent through good studies. Obviously, if there's a drop in population in a residential town in particular, businesses can see a significant downturn. Sometimes the only thing that can be done is to communicate the closure timeframe when it's known and help businesses to plan ahead. So how does a company work to cushion a downturn effect? The options can be limited in some places. It's important to explore opportunities for economic diversification and to be realistic about what's actually possible. In Australia, at least, most land use agreements negotiated over the past 20 years with Indigenous peoples, so in the Australian context, for instance, Indigenous land use agreements, don't address closure or matters beyond the productive life of the mine, most focusing on managing impacts and securing benefits during production. There are exceptions, as we'll see further on. There are often very complex considerations that relate to culture and Indigenous peoples in particular at mine closure, including the question of how different groups need to reconcile the altered landscape with ceremonies and other rituals. Sometimes there are questions about what to do with artifacts and other items that were removed to make way for mining. Are they returned? What's possible? And what are the processes associated with deciding what to do? And there's also the mining heritage itself, and safeguarding that heritage for future generations who may be connected to those aspects of the place. Social impact assessment for closure is certainly emerging as an area of research for the Centre, and we did look at these as a mechanism for facilitating participation. It's often difficult to determine when these studies are best undertaken, the extent to which other parties, particularly governments, should be involved, and what the focus of an SIA for closure should be. These studies are really difficult when there's not a good knowledge base to work from, i.e. social baseline studies and ongoing impact assessment and monitoring from earlier phases of mine life. There's also the contemporary overlay of human rights due diligence and the need to ensure that the human rights lens is applied in this closure phase of mining as well. The issue of transparency can be difficult in terms of communicating when closure might occur. Mining companies will keep exploring for as long as it's viable to do so, and this can mean that the horizon of closure can kind of become like a mirage. There are mines that we can probably all think of that were going to close but stayed open for years because near mine exploration came up with the goods. And depending on the context, some stakeholders will be hopeful that the mine will stay, while others will be hopeful that it will just go away. The final social aspect on this shortlist consists of engagement and participation processes and mechanisms, the topic of our study. So these, of course, are not particular to mine closure. As I mentioned earlier, they are relevant at every stage of the life cycle and have a role to play in all other aspects on the list. But there are certainly some particular challenges when engaging about mine closure, such as how to get communities engaged in mine closure when they don't seem to be interested, or how do we tell the community that we don't actually know how or when mine closure is going to happen. In our study, we wanted to understand the potential of specific participatory mechanisms to address some of the challenges particular to mine closure. The aim of our project was to outline the key principles of participation at the closure stage and provide some examples of how participatory processes have been used in mine closure situations around the world. We conducted a desktop review to explore what participatory processes are being used or could be used for mine closure. We selected 8 processes or mechanisms that in CSRM's experience or in the literature either have been used in mine closure, are familiar to the mining industry because they use them in the operational phases, or have the potential to be used in closure-related decisions and activities. And we also profiled 2 mechanisms developed in-house at SMI. For each process or mechanism, we described who should be involved and how, what the process entailed, and when it should happen. We also looked at potential enablers and barriers to their use in an actual closure context. So we don't actually advocate for any process over the others. We use them to discuss a series of key questions about participatory processes, particularly at the final stage of the mine life cycle. So while there are a few well-documented, publicly available examples of how participatory processes have been used at mine closure, we did find examples. A few are listed here. of where they have been used in closure contexts. So for example, participatory GIS was used for mapping landscape values at 2 closed mines in Finland. MMG used social impact assessment for closure at Century Mine. Rio Tinto conducted future visioning processes at Claremont. We looked at community reference groups, which Idemitsu used for their residual void planning in central Queensland. Participatory monitoring and evaluation was used for risk mapping in the Ukraine. Vale used strategic community investment to support economic diversification in Brazil. Newmont's impact and benefit agreements at Ahafo and woodcutters considered closure. And we looked at foundations and future funds as used by Inti Raymi Foundation in Bolivia and Newcrest's Lahia Sustainable Development Trust. So I'll go into a little more detail of a few of these examples further on, but I would just clarify here that while we identified these examples, we didn't conduct in-depth case studies into each of them. And the examples come from right across the globe, as you can see on the map here. So it's clear that with participation in any form, there's no one size fits all. There are many means to involve communities, and the methods must be appropriate to the goals, timeframes, resources available, levels of concern and capacity of those involved. We looked at some of the principles underlying effective participation. And we looked at these principles within the framework of the 3 pillars of strong participation processes defined in the 1992 Rio Declaration. These state that organisations adopting participatory processes should ensure that they're informative, open and just. And we applied this lens within the context of mine life cycle transitions. So in order to assess what the social impacts may be of mine closure, how it may affect them and how to prepare for it, people must have access to reliable and comprehensive data and information. Just as the decision to arrive in the community and build and operate a mine could not be made without social acceptance gained from open sharing of information and involvement in planning processes, people must also be given the opportunity to participate in decisions about how the company leaves. And the social, economic, environmental and psychological impacts of closure will be felt by communities who remain well into the future. And the power imbalance between companies and communities must be recognised and all steps taken to prevent harm and enhance opportunities. It's also important to give careful consideration to who participates, how, when and where they participate and what they need to be able to actually participate. So convening the right people and ensuring full representation is crucial to participatory processes and ensuring they can participate effectively. So as I said, I've selected some of the processes to share with you that we looked at, to share with you briefly today. And just one point that I'd like to make here is that it's not a matter of choosing one, as I said. It's important to use approaches that are best suited to the people, the time and the situation, and they can complement each other. And again, as I highlight 5 in the following slide, we didn't actually conduct in-depth case studies into these, but we were able to give a scan and draw out some highlights. So community structures to facilitate engagement, such as community reference groups, are often used by mining companies during operations, and they don't always take a future focus at that stage, but as closure approaches, if such structures exist, and have been active over the life of the mine, they provide an ideal starting point for opening those discussions around closure. And one example where this has occurred is the group at the Kuri Kuri aluminium refinery in the Hunter Valley, which gives input as the site master plan is developed in accordance with the regional strategy. And as I mentioned, though impact and benefit agreements are usually established before permitting and construction, they can address closure considerations even at that early stage, enabling a certain degree of foresight, planning and continuity. And at the former lead zinc woodcutters mine in the Northern Territory, Newmont has an agreement where decommissioning, rehabilitation and monitoring activities lead to handing land over to the traditional owners once all criteria and objectives have been met. Participatory monitoring and evaluation processes have been seen to contribute to improved socio-environmental management, particularly in regions where there are multiple industries. and they contribute to building public trust and confidence. The United Nations Development Programme is one group who have studied multiple uses of participatory monitoring in a mining context, and that the Bajo Alumbrera mine, one of the oldest open pit mining mega enterprises in Argentina, participatory water monitoring through and after closure has been important in ensuring good community outcomes and understanding. Future visioning is a participatory process that can be used specifically to focus on the subject of closure. As closure approaches, wisely convened and well-facilitated visioning processes can bring a community together to begin to think about the future they want. The Jabiru Master Plan, developed for the town associated with Rio Tinto's Ranger mine, is an example of a community visioning exercise specifically to bring people together around the future for the community after the mine closes. And the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining has developed a tool to facilitate a participatory process for mining towns in transition. Through a multi-stakeholder process of structured and facilitated discussion, it offers a way to build a shared understanding of the town's level of dependence on the mine, the available assets, and where future opportunities may lie. And so we looked also at the question of how people are enabled to participate in closure on a spectrum. The social scientists among you will be very familiar with this. Many processes can be used in different ways by adjusting the extent and nature of sharing that occurs, the degree of power or influence exerted by various participating community groups and organizations, and the degree of control they have. So beyond one-way communication or informing, participation is a two-way process with increasing degrees of involvement and responsibility. So at an initial level, there's consultation, such as when the Ancient Community Reference Group was presented with reports and details of 3 options for comment. Then there's coordination, as Hydro Aluminium did for repurposing their smelter site in the Hunter Valley in line with regional plans. After that, there's cooperation, as characterizes the relationship over rehabilitation and repurposing at the Woodcutters mine. Following that, there's collaboration. For example, the Latrobe Valley, 3 mining companies play a part alongside other regional stakeholders in planning and implementing a regional vision, all culminating in a convening company ceding control altogether to a subsequent authority or landholder, as the Iron Ore Company of Canada did with its gift of a railway to a First Nations corporation that now operates the line. And finally, the question of when. Engagement with stakeholders and communities around closure can and should start from the outset, but it really can be difficult to discuss closure when a mine is just being constructed and people are thinking about job and business opportunities. But it is still important to acknowledge that the mine will have a finite life and to raise awareness about what that will mean and use participatory processes throughout the mine life cycle to prepare for closure. And this can happen at any stage. At exploration, the knowledge base assembled can inform a broad closure vision. Participation around mine design and construction should include engaging stakeholders around the whole life cycle, including closure. And during operation, strategic community investment can involve stakeholders in building capacities that will be useful beyond the life of the mine. Participation is crucial at this stage to understand local values and visions for communities post-closure. And participatory approaches to monitoring can ensure early warning of slowly emerging risks. So this study evaluated real-world examples of 10 different participatory processes against key principles of participation. It concludes that the value and effectiveness of participatory processes at any stage of the mine life cycle is not in what you do, but how you do it. Many established processes can be implemented or adapted to suit different agendas, stakeholders, communities, and closure objectives, but must be conscientiously planned, adequately resourced, and diligently executed to be effective. The study also showed that different types of participation involve increasing complexity, effort, trust, and interdependence. The research reveals significant gaps in knowledge about how to ensure public participation in the decisions and implementation of transitions to mine closure, around where the responsibility lies, and how to transition to a full ceding of control. CSRM is continuing to explore these and other issues in its ongoing research under the Social Aspects of Mine Closure Research Consortium. So as I mentioned, you can find our full report on the mindclosure.net website, as well as details around our ongoing research. Information about our 2020 projects are on the projects page. And the e-library on the website contains numerous useful references that provide additional information or guidance about tools and techniques of participatory processes for mine closure around stakeholder engagement, post-mining land use decisions, rehabilitation, and more. It has over 250 articles, guides, and publications that address the many faceted and diverse range of social aspects associated with mine closure. Finally, I would also just like to acknowledge that our work will also be being presented at the Planning for Closure 2020 conference online in September, organised in collaboration with SMI, Centro de Minería at PUCV, and GECAMIN. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for the glitches at the beginning, and we're all here and happy to answer any questions.
Right, Sarah, thank you very much. So we have a number of questions that have come through during the presentation, and I'll hand them over to you, Sarah, and then if Camilla and Jan, if you would like to just pop your videos on, and then if Sarah feels that you'd like to handball the question to you, we'll do that. All right, so Sarah, the first one is really just looking for a bit of clarity around a number of terms that you've used, for example, stakeholder engagement, public participation, community consultation. How do these relate to each other, and which did your project focus on?
Okay, well, maybe I can take that one for you, Sarah.
I was just going to suggest, Joanne, thank you.
Just to give you a rest for a bit. So this is a good question and a fairly basic one, because there are a lot of terms. There's a lot of similarity between them. They all refer to ways for communities to interact with those who are making decisions about that will affect them or whose actions will affect them. But we understood a slight difference in that engagement, stakeholder engagement, is a two-way process between companies and communities. It very much needs companies to listen to the communities, to take on board what they've said, to respond to it, to answer to them, and be accountable to them. So that is a company-initiated process. Participation is somewhat broader. It need not be company-initiated. Sorry, yeah, participation. And it need not be company-initiated. And it will involve more of an emphasis on developing a shared vision, shared value, and ways to collaborate for future benefit that will be mutual benefit. So those are some of the differences that we're seeing between them. Our report concentrated probably not on the extremes. Sarah mentioned, 5 different stages of participation being possible. We didn't look so much at the extremes, the one-way communication level or the ceding control entirely to the community, but we concentrated on the beginning, on the middle, where companies can play a role, and where very often it was company-initiated processes, although the Latrobe Valley Regional Strategy and Future Vision was not initiated by companies, even though their participation alongside others was very important. So there were various different ways of collaborating or cooperating or consulting that were demonstrated in the examples that we came up with. So Sarah mentioned the Residual Void project at Ensham, where the company consulted the community about what did it think of each of its 3 options. The Newmont project at Woodcutters was a little bit different. They did do similar studies. They came up with 5 options that they thought were good, but they didn't just then present them to the traditional owners and say, okay, what do you think of each of these? They actually funded the traditional owners to commission whatever studies they thought were important. come up with their own list of options, and perhaps that process took 2 years. Perhaps they were lucky. There was quite a bit of overlap between the things that they thought were good options and the ones the community came up with. But then there was a lot more buy-in. They understood they were all working together towards something that they agreed about. So those are some of the differences that on that slightly nuanced scale of different ways of interacting.
Joanne, thank you. The next question I think is fairly provocative, and probably the subject of another presentation which we can do in a couple of weeks' time. But this one is, why would a company bother with community participation for closure? They're aiming to relinquish as soon as possible and wouldn't delay a lot to talk to people without the scientific basis to understand the rehabilitation issues. So I don't know who would like to pick up on that one.
I might hand that one to Camilla.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to this one. Thanks, Sarah. So I hope that companies will bother. And after all, there is industry credibility and ICMM's principles that require member companies to manage their impacts and to contribute to long-lasting social and economic well-being, rather than just make maximum profits as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, companies and governments, and this doesn't apply just for mining and mine closure, they often believe that local knowledge cannot add to the expertise of their university educated staff or experts, consultants. But this downplays not only the people's rights, but also the crucial relevance of the context in determining the effectiveness of outcomes, and the fact that the locals in the end will be those who will need to live with any plans and decisions implemented in that area. And what we need is a considered approach to the questions that Sarah mentioned and that we examined in this project is who should participate, what should they participate in, and how and when they should participate with respect to the closure. And with this, the contribution of various knowledge, of shared understanding is more likely to be productive, hopefully.
Thanks, Camilla. Yeah, I was troubled by that question on a couple of levels, so thank you for that. The next one is, can you offer any insights into how one handles the changing nature of community and value over the long life of a mine prior to closure?
Thank you. I might take this one and just say it's so important for community participation, engagement to be an ongoing process. And so if a company is engaging and integrated with the community throughout the mine life cycle, these are changes that they will be able to keep a track of and be monitoring. Social impact assessments are regularly updated across the mine life cycle. The information that they give could be fed into understanding how things will be dealt with, because certainly there's a difference between a 15-year gold mine and a 100-year copper mine in terms of understanding the community and what the implications will be at closure. We recently were working with a group from the Ministry of Mines in Niger, and they have a mine in the north of Niger that's been operating since the 1960s, and a town has built up in the desert of now 120,000 people. So it's going from 0 to 120,000 is quite daunting to have to deal with at closure, and actually to turn around and start then to say, okay, what's our community? So yeah, I would say really it's ideally if it can be ongoing throughout the life of the mine. I don't know if anybody else wants to add something to that.
Perhaps I'd just add to your Niger example, Sarah, that you know, there are other developments that aren't necessarily part of the company or the community, but that are outside political, for instance, developments and so on, that certainly, again, change whatever plans you may originally have had for what would happen after production ceased to what is realistically possible at the end. And technological changes and things like that all happen in the interval between when a mine starts and when it finishes. And so in many regions now, people are talking about alternative energy options at former mine sites that were unthinkable earlier, because we didn't have the technology to do those things and the pressures weren't on to find those alternatives. So there's whole lots of things that do have to be kept tabs of, and I think you're absolutely right that the idea of a constant process and a constant process with the community participating is the only way to be able to keep up with these changes.
All right, the next question is basically starts, thank you for an interesting talk, Sarah. On the slide entitled Who, about the actors involved in the participatory process, you distinguish between local businesses and suppliers/contractors. I'm curious to know why this is the case, especially given that you also highlighted local content. I guess I'm curious to know the nature of local businesses you're referring to.
I think that for that slide, it was very much, let's not forget anybody, and knowing that we would forget somebody, but it's not to make a distinction, but it's to say, look, really consider all the stakeholders, and you have to consider all the stakeholders and understand that the different stakeholders will have different concerns and different needs. A contractor in a country that is very much from the local community and it's a local business will have different concerns from a contractor that may be based in the capital city and has clients around the country, and it will be different from a contractor that is overseas. And local businesses, maybe restaurants and hotels. So really that slide is just to remind us that there are a whole range of stakeholders and they all need to be considered, and their particular needs and context considered as well.
Okay.
I'm going to add to that one as well, if I may. So, yeah, not all local businesses will be suppliers and contractors to the mine. And in fact, even the suppliers and contractors, we'd hope, would not be exclusively focused on supplying and contracting to the mine. So I think that that was also part of the distinction we were trying to make, that other businesses will be affected. The local coffee shop and restaurant that you mentioned will be affected, even though they may not have been supplying catering, for example, to the mine or whatever. So, and I think that that's what we don't want people to overlook, and don't think only in terms of the only workers affected will be our employees, the only businesses affected will be our suppliers. No, there's going to be much wider ramifications.
All right, I just would like to just remind people, if you could please just put your questions or comments into the Q&A button. It's very tricky for me to be able to flip backwards and forwards between the chat function and the Q&A function. So if you could just pop it into the Q&A and then I'll pick it up. We've got a number of questions still, so hopefully we'll get through all of them in time. Question here is, do companies actually do SIAs, foreclosure? Are they required by regulation? And is there an agreed process for social impact assessments at closure that you can point us to?
I'll hand that to Joanne, perhaps, to answer that first. Oh, Joanne, you're on mute.
Joanne, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, companies certainly do SIAs for closure. For example, the Waihi mine in New Zealand has done multiples of these and has been subject of this mirage of closure that Sarah mentioned, where people keep thinking, oh, closure's happening, and then they discover something or they decide to go underground or whatever. Century Mine in North Queensland also did an SIA for closure. The big difference is that SIAs for closure are voluntary. There's no regulatory requirement for that to happen. There is a regulatory requirement in many at least, jurisdictions for an SIA to be done for approvals, but there's no requirement people think about what the social impacts of closure will be. And so it is up to companies being particularly responsible and undertaking to do that. And because it's not compulsory, I guess there's not actually specific guidelines in the same way, because in point of fact, even for the ones for approvals, they've been very late coming to the party of having guidelines for people how to do it. So not surprisingly, the guidelines on how to do it for closure are not actually forthcoming yet, but most reputable guidelines now say this shouldn't be only about approvals. So the International Association of Impact Assessment is talking about it as something that can happen at various stages. And I think that like most of the processes that we outlined, we just need to be thinking about how might we need to modify that to do it for closure. But I don't think we should be turned off by the fact that this set of guidelines is not specifically about closure.
All right, thank you, Jan. The next one is one which looks at timelines for closure regularly change due to a variety of factors. How does the impact on the engagement process? How does this impact on the engagement process? All right, I've got everyone on mute.
Yeah, no, sorry, I was busy. I was reading the question. Yes, and it's coming. I'll let Joanne also say something, but just that this mirage of closure and generations of people, we know of mines where generations of families have worked in the mine, and each generation has been told that it was about to close. So it's so important to be open and to have those lines of communication open, and to be really thinking about diversifying and different options. And throughout that sort of, in those cases, perhaps the concern we hear a lot with mining companies is that they don't want to talk about the possibility of closure as well, because they don't want people to be nervous about it, thinking that they might be losing their jobs or their economic activity. So it's a delicate balance.
Jan, did you want to comment?
Yes, I probably could add. I agree, and of course the biggest thing about mine closure that isn't predicted is that most mines, 75% I think it might be, numbers aren't my big strong suite, but I think many mines, more than half mines that close, it's not a planned closure. It's not, oh, we ran out of that, there's no more here, we'll pack up and go away. No, so absolutely planning to a fixed timeline is not a possibility. And I guess that is one of the biggest challenges in many aspects of the social aspects of mining, I guess, is the unpredictability of it, and the need for processes that will work in dynamic situations that can't be really certainly mapped out. And I guess that's part of the distinction between, or part of the resistance, the problem even, that many of the professionals who work in mining are used to much more certainty than you can have in general around social issues and around timelines for closure. And so it's negotiating that and learning ways to deal with uncertainty, constant change and dynamism, and realizing the value of openness in that, so that communities understand the many factors that companies are taking into consideration when they determine that they need to stop operations at a place, or that they can continue, that it's still feasible, etc. I think that the relationship of trust and of openness and accountability is fundamental to having that dealt with in a participatory way that will be satisfactory to everybody.
All right, thank you. The next question is one about a case study, and there are a couple of words here which are new to me, and I think they're French. So Sarah, I'm hoping you can help me out on this. So the closure of the Kuri aluminium smelter followed a 40-year interaction with the community, initially hostile on the part of the neighboring vignerons, which I think is winemakers, neighboring wine farms, and supportive by direct employees until there was a broad community support for the company at the time of closure. This process occurred progressively and not evenly over the whole period of operation. Are there ways in which community acceptance can be accelerated? So first help me with the French word there, Sarah, and then if you've got an answer for me.
I've got the question. Yes, I think it's the winemaker. So Neville, you've been in Australia long enough to know that winemaking is the thing. Joanne, I'm afraid I'm going to point it to you just because you know the Kuri aluminium smelter case study well. But I would say that the question of are there ways in which community acceptance can be accelerated, I think it's not. It really comes down to the relationships of trust that are developed, and you know, there's a lot written on trust and how to build trust, and trust isn't necessarily everybody liking you. It's about seeing that the company is acting fairly and justly, and a lot of that comes down to how it reacts to community concerns and how it considers the community. So if there is hostility, it's very frequently because the company has done something that has impacted upon the community, and that hostility is because they don't see that the company is going to be a welcome presence. So it's clear that there's been a lot of work and that it has progressed, and it's never linear, and there's always ups and downs. So starting well from the outset, I'd say, is a really good way of helping social acceptance to occur. But Joanne, I'll let you talk more to the actual case study.
Okay, well, I guess the case study was brought up by the questioner just as an example of something where it did take 40 years of relationship building. It wasn't always a smooth and easy path. So I think your points about the constancy of the interaction needed and the respect needed to be shown, and the trust that has to be built up are very important. It works at every stage of the mine life cycle. I mean, Pebble Mine in Alaska is known, well, Pebble Mine, I say mine, Pebble, the Pebble project in Alaska is known as this great, you know, bonanza of a gold and copper deposit that nobody is ever going to get to develop, because even though at one stage they had in place a very good community participation process, various factors meant that changed. Change of ownership in the company, change of personnel within company, etc., and that particular process got sidelined, short-circuited, and what was a supportive community became a very hostile community. So these things can change very readily, and I guess it's not as easy, even as environmental predictions. You know, if you do this, and you tweak that, okay, these plants will grow or won't grow if they have this much water, but you can't do that with people. You can't just say, oh, well, so long as you do this, they'll stay on side. No, they won't, and if you haven't got a good trusting relationship that's built on mutual respect. So I guess that there's no ready formula for how, and there's lots of attempts to try and explain what the basis of trust is, what the basis of openness and accountability is, and how you avoid conflict or defuse conflict. All of these things are helpful guidelines, but they don't just say, okay, we'll accelerate the way the communities get them on side, because that just makes communities suspicious. They only want us to participate so that we'll agree to whatever they want to do. Well, we're not going to go along with it that easily. So I'm sorry I can't give a quick recipe, but I do believe, if there's genuineness and it is sustained, it gives a bit of hope.
All right, we've got a fair number of questions that we need to get through in the next sort of 5 minutes. So maybe if we can really focus the answers, and I'll try and get through the questions fairly quickly. So this one is, thank you for the presentation, very interesting. A few questions about the map of closing mines, which was interesting. How was the information compiled? Are there really that many mines slated for closure in Australia? Is this information available for other countries?
I'll hand that one over to Camilla. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. So the information was compiled from S&P database, which is commercial database that UQ have rights for, and so it's not publicly available. And I don't know if I covered all the responses or all the questions. So
it was really just where you got the information from, and is it available for other countries? So you could do a similar mapping for other countries as well.
Exactly, it's a global database, so we can do it for all countries, and it's not publicly available.
Okay, thank you. And this one's more a comment, and it's really ongoing assessments and closure plans. Plan variations need to be a part of mining operations that are long life and varied, depending on economic conditions. And this is particular for long life gold operations. So yes, I think we.
Yeah, and exactly. And I've been looking. Thanks, Maury. These are really interesting points that he's made. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
All right, and then the other one is, how would participatory processes help with contentious issues, such as the economic transition plan developed for North Stradbroke Island? Right, who would like to have got that one?
That's one for Joanne, definitely.
Okay, well, I'll try and be very brief, but basically the idea of North Stradbroke, that it has been a bit contentious, and I guess what it highlights for us is that what people can't always expect participatory processes that closure to deliver is a win-win situation that everybody will be happy with. And it kind of raises the related question of what is consensus? What do we mean when we say everybody should agree to this? Well, it's a bit like sustainability, actually. There's a lot of definitions. People don't necessarily all agree with them. But the idea is that if you're all working together, rather than in bilateral, okay, let's do a deal here, there's more chance of people understanding that this is the optimal situation. It's not my number one preference, but it does give the best deal for the biggest number of people, and does seem to really utilise our resources and put us on a reasonably sustainable track. So I think that that's the sort of thing that needs to, that they have been working towards with the Stradbroke solutions, but it doesn't mean you'll never face contention.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Right, you mentioned community, corporate and regulatory barriers to social closure transitions. What would be examples of these, and how could participation help?
Camilla, I'll pass that to you.
Yeah, I can take this one, thanks. So example of community barriers would be very polarized or divided community, and this can be because of traditional or long-standing divisions or conflicts, for example, in India for tribal people and Dalits. Of course, no community is uniform, and there are always wide spectrums of values and views. And also, like, mine is bringing conflict, so it's also like it's connecting with resettlements and displacement, and divided opinions about whether the town will be better or worse after mining ends may be a community barrier. Regulatory barriers include conditions, for example, that the conditions require only one solution. There is example of ranger mine when the pit, because of the conditions, needed to be backfilled. And it also shuts off many options that maybe could be valuable or more appealing for community. It shuts them off. And the company barrier, it's usually, it could be connected with effort to relinquish as soon as possible with minimal residual risk, which also eliminates the options that could be maybe preferred more by local communities and other stakeholders. Yeah, I think this quick response should be fine.
All right. I think I'm going to take the last question now, because I see we're pretty close to the end of the session. And I suppose it ends on an interesting question: are the social effects of mine closure mainly positive or negative? I'd love to end on a positive note, but look forward to your answer. Sarah.
I'll pass that one to
let me do it. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to say they're neither wholly positive nor wholly negative. And you only have to think of some of the examples Sarah was talking about when she gave examples of what are the effects of mine closure, like livelihood effects. Okay, some people might be better off not working, not having other people in the mine who are working, other people in their family who are working in a mine and coming home with their coal dust all over their clothes or whatever. Some people would be better off if they get a job in rehabilitation. Some people, a lot of people probably will be worse off if they lose their quite good paying job in the mine and have to either move away for work or not. So it's always going to be very mixed. There will be positive and negative effects. It's like environmental, and many of them you don't realize at the beginning, and only later do you find out, we only have to think of what are put up as leading practice examples. The Australian government has put out a whole suite of booklets on leading practice in mining. How many of those examples that are in those books have you since heard of complaints about or problems with or whatever? So it's not easy to say, yeah, that was good. Oh yeah, great. No, it's going to be mixed. I'm going to leave it at that. Sorry, mixed, Neville, sorry.
But absolutely. And I would just say that the more you involve the community in understanding what those impacts may be and planning for them, and the more that they have the power and the autonomy to actually think of alternatives and solutions and to have a say in what's decided, the better those outcomes will be.
All right. Well, then it just leaves me to say thank you very much, Sarah, Camilla, and Joanne, for your talk and your question and answer session today. Incredibly interesting, and really appreciate the work that you're doing. To everybody else, please be safe. We look forward to seeing you again next week, Tuesday at the same time. We will put out notification of what the next presentation will be for next week within the next day or so. And yes, if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to post them onto the website. We really do appreciate your feedback. And if any particular topics you'd like us to cover, if you could let us know. So thank you very much and have a good week.
Thank you.